Nice to be back with friends in Southern California. I guess it was 2 years ago or so when I came down and did a little presentation on
yes, a little over, yeah, about 2 years ago.
Stands, yes.
At the Huntington.
So today we're going to look, as Tom indicated, about the scholar's table, so-called scholar's painting table, and its accoutrement objects. And the presentation, as the title indicates, is divided into more or less 2 parts. Firstly, I want to look at the historical development and the variety of construction styles of the painting table. And then I'll go into a little bit more about its use and its placement. And secondly, I will go into the subject of scholars' objects a bit generally to introduce them. And then I will look more closely at the most common objects that were used on the desktop. So to start with, let's look at a little bit about the history of the painting table. During the Qin dynasty, when the classics were being burned, Fu Sheng hid a copy of the classic of history in the wall of his house. And after the establishment of the Han dynasty, the new emperor sent one of his high officials to study this text with Fu. So this Tang dynasty painting, or a copy of a Tang dynasty painting, shows Fu Sheng sitting at a low table. This kind of reflects the early mat culture of the Chinese. Up around the Tang dynasty, chairs began to be introduced, and high tables to match chair heights came into being. But here we see an early form of a table. It's not a very big table. It has an inkstone and a brush on top of it. It's got these interesting kind of curved legs with a stretcher, and also has these little everted flanges on each end. If we move along into the Song period, we can see the same style of table was still being used at that time. It just adjusted to the new height. Here it still has the everted ends, and we don't often see painting tables with these qiaotou, or everted ends as they're called, but actually Zhou Ershui in the Kangxi period writes about the painting table, and he indicates that these were useful in preventing the scrolls from rolling off the end of the table. This is actually these tables are actually quite rare. I mean, we find excavated pottery examples and some excavated wood ones from the pre-Tang period, Han to Tang. This is actually a surviving piece, lacquer piece, and the lacquer was dated, carbon dated to the 5 Dynasties period. But indeed, a very rare example. The other early form of table relates to the platform. And in this painting of a screen and a screen, we see a scholarly gentleman sitting on a platform, and he has a low platform style table, which is serving as his desk. In fact, the platform itself was somewhat used as a desktop too, where a scholar would sit and kind of spread out his materials around himself. And we were just talking about Wen Zheng Hong, and one thing he said about the platform daybed was whether for sitting, sleeping, or relaxed reclining, there was no way in which they were not convenient. In moments of pleasant repose, literati gentlemen would spread out classics or historical texts, examine works of calligraphy, arrange sacrificial meats or fruits, or set out a pillow and a mat. To what use were they not well suited? The platform of style bed actually also increased in height as the chair height culture was popularized. And here we see a platform style table. It still has its base stretcher, and scholars gathered around it in a literati gathering. Moving along, you can see the similar style table. Still, we have this intermediate leg, but the stretcher now removed, the base stretcher. Also, during the Song Dynasty, we begin to see this kind of classical corner leg style table. This is a painting at the National Palace Museum. And if we look closely at the detail, which isn't real clear, but we can notice that it's a lacquer table. It's either carved or maybe inlaid with mother of pearl or painted with gold decoration. It also has looks like it has a stone panel in the top. It's a high-waisted form. You see these kind of pillared-like struts on the corner. And then the leg comes down and it's a cleft style foot that rests on a stretcher. So this is an early example of what later becomes a very classical, traditional form. This is an illustration from an early Ming publication of Shixiangji, the Western Chamber. And it's a smaller painting table. And it's of this, we call a flush-sided style. There's no waist, but it's a corner leg form. In Chinese, we call it Simian Ping. And this table also has a interesting design in that it's like a low table with legs, kind of leg extensions on it. So if we look here at this Huang Wali piece, probably 17th, 18th century example, we can see a similar style of table. Here, the legs are actually removable, but in many cases, just the style of this table was continued to be reproduced, and the legs were not removable. This is late Yuan, the early Ming Dynasty painting at the museum, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Here we see the classical corner leg table with its horsehoof feet, no stretcher. So I include here an example of probably early Qing to mid-Qing period that's in my collection in Shanghai. Basically, you can see the same pattern really hasn't changed much over 300 or 400 years between the painting and this example here. And of course, this is what I mean by the kind of one of the classical styles of table construction. The other form of very traditional style is what we call a recessed leg painting style. And here we have the leg is inset. You have like a big round leg, which is like it's very architectural in a sense. It's like a column, and then you have a beam going across with this apron. that supports the tabletop. And the inset image is another table I have. This one has also been carbon dated, the lacquer carbon dated to early Ming period. This is probably one of the most common styles of table in traditional Chinese furniture. Of course, those two basic table styles aside, there were also many variations. And here's a group of painting tables that I put together. If we look at the one in the upper right-hand corner, it's a round leg table that we call in Chinese yuan bao yuan, which means the round wrapping the round. And it's actually what I call a bamboo style table, because even though it's not really carved like bamboo, the construction imitates the way bamboo furniture is constructed with these kind of wraparound stretchers, and also the layering of bamboo pieces one on top of another. And in the middle, we see a piece that's actually carved like bamboo, a recessed leg table style. Traditionally, the corner leg table has a horsehoof foot, but you see this kind of hybrid styles emerging more into the Qing dynasty, where the leg is straight without a hoof. And then the other table on the bottom right is a very kind of typical Qing style piece in Zitan, still a corner leg table, but no waist and stretchers and spandrels added. We're quite indebted to Wang Xixiang for his classification of Chinese furniture, which gives us the terminologies to use to describe certain pieces. These terminologies were not they were not necessarily used throughout history, but they provide kind of a basis for us to think about furniture today. For example, he uses the term 桌子 to describe a corner leg table, and he used the term an to describe a recessed leg table. But he also defined the painting table to be a large table that's more than 70 centimeters in width. And this is actually not necessarily the case. Narrow tables were also used as painting tables, or narrower than 70 centimeters in any case. And these illustrations I have here are all probably tables that are less than 70 centimeters in width. So I want to move on now a little bit to use and placement, and kind of following on what I just mentioned about the size of painting tables. I want to quote an inscription from a wine table that we discovered. Wine tables are relatively small tables that were used for dining. The inscription in part reads, "Not only for one occasion, paintings to the left, classics to the right, sometimes a lute set lengthwise, or the occasional libation of sweet wine." So this inscription too indicates that we cannot be too dogmatic about the specific forms of tables and their use. But nevertheless, the painting table was central to the scholar's studio. And I would like to introduce the Feng Mengzheng's 13 Pursuits in the Scholar's Studio to provide some further context towards its use. These pursuits or activities include the browsing books, burning incense and brewing tea, water tasting, playing the guqin, clearing the dust and cultivating a quiet mind, practicing calligraphy from copybooks, appreciating paintings, engaging in brushwork, enjoying the fish in the pool and listening to the birds, enjoying the plants, the study of ancient Chinese characters, and enjoying scholars' rocks. And related to clearing the dust and cultivating a quiet mind is this phrase that became quite popular during the Song Dynasty: a clean desk, a bright window. The Northern Song calligrapher Su Zhimei said, "One of the joys in life is to have a clean desk by a bright window, a fine brush, inkstone, paper, and ink." And also it was said of Guo Xi, the famous landscape painter, on days when he was going to paint, he would seat himself at a clean table by a bright window, burn incense to right and left. He would choose the finest brushes, the most exquisite ink, and wash his hands and clean the inkstone as though he were expecting a visitor of rank. He waited till his mind was calm and undisturbed, and then began. Gao Lian was sort of an eccentric scholar, playwright who lived during the late Ming Dynasty. And he also wrote quite a bit about the literati lifestyle. And he said about the studio that it should be bright and peaceful, but not too open. Brightness and cleanliness nourish the mind and spirit. But if the room is too spacious, it can bewilder the eyes. Outside, climbing vines should cover the wall, and potted junipers and pines, or 2 or 3 orchids should be set out and sown with fragrant grass to impart a flourishing impression. To the side, place a basin for washing inkstones, and in another basin near the window, raise 5 to 7 goldfish so as to observe the phenomena of all natural life. So this is a Kangxi period illustration to a text called the Imperial Edicts. And here we see, well, it looks like a monk or an abbot pulling his desk up next to a window. It's set adjacent to the window, and also we have this basin set outside. Maybe there are goldfish in the basin swimming around. So this was one idea. It's connected to the pursuits that we read about earlier of enjoying the vegetation and fish and birds. Here is another illustration from the same set. Here, the painting table is a little bit more central, placed in front of a screen that divides the room. But it's also next to a window where one looks out on a big rock with, looks like lilies and pomegranates flourishing. And then here is another more kind of centrally located painting table set in front of a moon gate that looks out on a courtyard with the Taihu rock. And then adjacent, we can see the ripples in the water that must be a pond right outside the windows there. So these examples all relate to the kind of the proximity of natural impressions as a viewpoint from the painting table. Here is a more palace style scene of a high official. It's a study that seems to look out over a courtyard, probably facing south. And we see the painting table there with an incense table set in front of it, an incense stand with a censer on it. And this is a more rural scene of a small studio. Painting table once again set at the center, this time perpendicular to the opening. And here again, the incense stand set in front of the painting table. Here is another scene, kind of a courtyard or a mountain villa with a small studio. The scholar has the windows all open that looks out into a small courtyard, but it also is borrowing the landscape, as is said, from the towering trees and mountains. Yeah. Of course, the painting table was taken outside during certain times of the season. Here we see a literati gathering in a thatched pavilion. And here, the painting table actually drawn right out into the garden. So this is basically the summarizing the table, its kind of development and how it was used, how it was placed. Also, we've seen pretty much that it was sort of a male-dominated phenomena, but it wasn't always. And if you look at the image at the bottom center, this is a painting by a late Ming lady called Xue Susu. She was a Chinese courtesan and actually one of the great courtesans of the great 8 courtesans of the Ming Dynasty. And she was an accomplished painter and poet. So in fact, this may be somewhat of a self-portrait. With that, I'm going to move on to scholars' objects and get into the desktop objects. But first, I would like to say that amongst the traditional arts and crafts, the so-called miscellany of the scholar studio in Chinese, Wenfang Zaxiang, they have the most far-reaching scope of any other category. It's a very loose category. And of course, these objects had many uses and they were made from a wide range of materials. Some were very intricately worked, others were naturally smooth. And the patrons for them also varied. You had the imperial family to military and literati officials, monks and priests, as well as the nouveau riche and commoners. And of course, rich with aesthetic interests, many were made to assist the literati in their artistic pursuits. And others were more simply laden with historical, cultural, or aesthetic interest. But grouped together, they form a big, loosely bound category of collectibles. And the idea of scholars' objects as a category of art has been around for quite a long time. During the Tang and Song dynasties, there were already detailed specifications for the 4 treasures of the study, the 4 arts of the literati gentleman, the 4 arts of living, which encompassed a number of objects. But during the Song period, Jiao Shigu's Dongtian, Qinglu also extended the range of literati connoisseurship to ancient bronzes, rock art, stone screen panels, and ancient stone carvings. And then in the early Ming period, we have Cao Cao's Gagu Yaoluan. There's an English translation for this, by the way. It's called it's the Percival David one. I'll try to get it for you, Tom. I can't remember it right now, but he also included items of gold and silver, lacquerware, brocaded fabrics, and rare woods. And then by the late Ming period, there's a whole slew of literati literature that deals with architecture and garden treatment, furniture and its placement, Buddhist shrines, culinary appreciation, apparel, and accessories for travel. And of course, it continued to expand throughout the Qing dynasty. And today, these antique playthings are collectively known as the miscellany of the scholar's studio. And as for the appreciation of them, Shen Defu of the late Ming wrote that connoisseurship should be based on the antiquity of an object. So we find most contemporary authors were very consistent in their praise of Song and Yuan dynasty objects. However, also high-end reproductions were also considered acceptable. For instance, Gao Lian says that the modern small red lacquer stands made in Jiangsu are only slightly inferior to those made in Japan. A lot of Japanese lacquerware was quite highly appreciated during the late Ming period. And Wen Zhengheng also, on a number of cases, indicates that it's fine to have reproductions, if, especially making them from hardwoods, if you follow the ancient patterns very carefully. So objects that were intricately worked and those that retained kind of their raw natural qualities both appealed to the literati aesthetic. And here we can see during the Song Dynasty porcelains imitating the kind of ancient jades and bronzes. Then during the Ming and Qing period, you have the use of jade imitating ancient bronzes. There was also a revival of bronzeware during the Song, Yuan, and Ming periods, which imitated somewhat in a new style the ancient bronzes, but they were not exact copies. They were in the style of the ancient bronzes. And here is a modern day archaic gui fashioned from Zetan, which also recalls the ancient bronze tradition and follows in this footstep of this kind of archaic reproduction that is so common to Chinese antiquities. In a sense, these objects are quite somewhat artificial and contrived. On the other hand, we have these that are much more natural and spontaneous: coral, root, and rocks. And these two extremes, the contrived and the natural, can be said to represent Wei and Wu Wei, these concepts and their extreme different styles. Of course, even the naturally styled objects were manipulated to a certain extent. So with that somewhat introduction, I'd like to move a little bit more into the actual objects used on the desktop. So the traditional treasures of the study, of course, as we saw, included the brush, inkstone, paper, and inkstone. But in essence, it also extended to the many other accessories that were associated with writing and painting. For example, Gallien's suggestion for items to place on the table included, aside from inkstone, an old brush, an old bronze water dropper, an old porcelain brush rest, a speckled bamboo brush pot, an old ceramic brush washer, and a paste jar for repairing damaged pages and paintings, and a bronze or stone paperweight. We start with looking at the brushes. Of course, the brush handle was most commonly made of bamboo, but more exotic ones were made of gold, silver, jade, ivory, carved lacquer, precious hardwoods, and spotted bamboo was also a favorite. And of course, the brush tip itself was quite sophisticated. They were made from goat, weasel, pig, mouse, buffalo, wolf, rabbit hair, and combinations thereof. Here are three brushes. The far left brush is one at the Shoso-in in Japan, which is thought to be a Tang Dynasty example. Old brushes are quite rare, and some things like this can only find in Japan. The two others are lacquer handles. The one in the center has what's called a rhino skin pattern lacquer. And then, of course, the carved lacquer brush on the right is very typical of the late Ming period. The brush was said to have four virtues: and its pointedness, its evenness, its roundness, and its strength. Of course, brushes do wear out, and there's an ancient saying that says a worn out brush should be buried. And in fact, there aren't that many old brushes that have survived, and it may be the reason. So the best brushes were produced in the Jiangnan area. Huzhou, outside of Hangzhou, was considered one of the finest production areas. Also the Huizhou area of Anhui. And these areas still produce very fine brushes today. Of course, the next thing is, what do you do with the brush when you're not using it? You lay it down on a brush rest, which keeps the tip elevated from the table. They were made from a wide range of materials and appear in a number of different styles, but the most common style was the mountain style, which could accommodate 2, 3, or more brushes. There was also another style of brush rest called the bichuang, or it's a brush platform that the brush was laid down upon and nestled in the groove. 1 or 2 brushes could be set in a rest like that. Of course, you needed ink. And here we see that ink being ground in the images above from the ink stick onto the inkstone. Below we see instinct. This what's called Hui Mo indicates ink from Huizhou or Anhui period, Anhui region, which was also famous for producing ink stones and ink cakes. Ink was made by collecting the soot from specific kinds of oil. And it was mixed with animal glue and various other binders. Sometimes it had incense blended in or medicinal scents. And it was quite a sophisticated process. And the painters and calligraphers were also very selective about the quality of ink that they were using. When Zheng Heng wrote in his treatise that since ink sticks are often displayed on tables, they should also have a certain elegance of shape. And here are a number of old ink sticks. They often have imagery on them or calligraphy. And it's a area of collecting. I know people that collect ink sticks. It was also quite a sophisticated area during the late Ming period. And this is an ink cake that was produced in the Huizhou region of Anhui. And there were a couple of major families that produced very fine ink sticks and ink cakes. This is a cake form. And their products were actually published in the ink catalogs, ink stick catalogs. And here we see an example of this late Ming colored woodblock print from the Chengshi Moyuan, which was included probably 100 or more designs of ink cakes. There are a couple of these publications that were produced during this period of time. Of course, the ink stick also had a little stand for its use to lay it down when it was not being used. And these are small, just more or less like the illustration above. You can see an ink stick laying on a little stand. Not much recorded about the ink stick stand, or the Mo Chuang as it's called, until the Qianlong period. So it may be relatively late in development. Inkstones, but on the other hand, have been around since ancient times. They are what provided the fine abrasive surface for grinding the hard ink cake, along with water to produce the liquid ink. And in the upper left here is an example of Han Dynasty Ink Stone. It's actually not a real inkstone, it's a pottery piece that was buried, it's excavated, but it imitates an old form. And you also see the little grinding block on top, which probably indicates that they were not using ink sticks at that time, but maybe an ink powder. And the stone was used to grind it into the ink. The other example on the upper right is also an excavated piece. Should be a Song Dynasty fish-shaped piece. It's a soft, relatively soft stone, and it also already has the inkwell in it. And then the bottom left is a Song Dynasty ink stone, an excavated piece that is well known. Here we see the ink stone kind of more the shape that people are more familiar with. although there's no real pool, the ink actually drains down to the base as it's ground. And then the Jade Ink Stone is a piece that was excavated from the early Ming tomb of Zhu Tan. He was the prince of the son, the prince of the first Ming emperor. And his tomb has a lot of interesting materials in it. Jade was actually said to produce a very fine ink because of course, you need to have a very fine ink stone to go with it as well. These are also excavated objects from the late Ming period. These were excavated near Shanghai, another jade stone. Here we also see the cases that were used to protect the ink stone. And then ink stones, of course, varied. There were porcelain ones. So the one in the center is made of Yixing clay, the purple sand clay. And then there's a stone one here too. It was quite popular in the Fujian area. These ones made from the Qingdao. It's kind of a basalt, fine granite stone. Of course, the most common ink stone was the Duan style stones. They're a fine sedimentary stone, and stone like this was produced in a number of areas in China. Guangzhou, Guangxi produced very fine ink stones. Also, the Huizhou area of Anhui was very famous again for ink stones. And it was quite sophisticated too in selecting ink stones, because you wanted a stone that would produce fine ink that would also not damage the brush tip. And old stones like this were also collector's items, and they would be also passed on from generation to generation. And so actually today you have many people who just collect ink stones. It's a whole big subject, and I'm afraid this is about as far as I'm going to go with it. But I do, one other thing is just one reason why I enjoyed ink stones was because of the beautiful cases that they were often came with. The one on the very left has a Longyan wood case. Longyan wood has this beautiful kind of ripply grain as it ages. This is probably 300 or 400-year-old case, and the inkstone was too. And then a little Zetan case covering the skin-shaped inkstone, and then a gourd-shaped case made of Nanmu, which was also quite popular as a wood for scholars. There were a number of water vessels also associated with the Russian ink, because you needed water to grind the ink. So you had the small little vessels that water could be poured from. The one in the center is probably a Song Dynasty bronze, very small, probably only an inch tall. I collected this many years ago in Anhui, Huizhou area. Very sophisticated. And then the one on the left is amber. It's a nice little Zetan stand. And then the agate, you can see from the shape of it that the water could be poured out. There's a little lily, lotus bud blossoming from the side. And then you also have this form that uses a little ladle. This is a bronze piece with a Shishou inscription. It's not probably an actual Shishou piece. He was a late Ming bronzier I guess we could call him, who actually specialized in this kind of technique with the silver inlays. But as with many famous artisans, their names were used over and over again as kind of meaning in the style of. The larger water vessels were used to rinse the brush and also adjust its tonality, the tonality of the ink. And then there were these small little brush palettes that were used to kind of fine tune the brush tip. Generally, they're quite small objects that you can hold in a hand. And the one on the lower right is interesting, somewhat unique, where it uses a small little bronze mirror. And it's being used as it could be also a brush washer, it could be a brush palette. But making use of an antique object and incorporating it in one's tools, desktop tools. Then there's the whole subject of brush holders. And we'll start with these type because the brush pot wasn't really popularized seemingly until the mid to late Ming period. So early brush holders were this style of rack. And in the center is an excavated piece from a Tang tomb, which indicates relatively early use of this style of brush holder. These others are Song Dynasty illustrations. And we see in the early Ming period the style. And then another style was these ceramic pieces that had round openings in the top, and also often a rectangular opening to hold an ink stick, just like we see in the painting. And then there was another style called the brush screen, which was like a little table screen, and it had this kind of rack in front where brushes could be placed. These two forms really didn't survive into the Qing period. And that by that time, the brush pot itself had become relatively widely popularized. As I mentioned, early brush pots, we don't really see them until in any kind of visual reference material or literary reference until the middle of the Ming period. And when we do see them, they often occur with a stand or a base on them. These two at the bottom right are both Ming Dynasty pieces. The one left is an excavated Zipan piece. It has a separate base. And then this is the Wanli period, has a Wanli period inscription. And it's also on a separate base. I have spent a fair amount of time studying brush pots, and I've come to the conclusion that probably the earliest brush pots too were shaped from materials that were hollow inside, like the ivory and bamboo. And this choir palm also had a soft, pithy center, so it would have been relatively easy to hollow out. And when we come across these kind of brush pots, they also quite good age. So, as I mentioned, a lot of brush pots have these bases on them. And in fact, it became the pattern to take brush pot with a base. This is not actually a separate base, but the brush pots just continue to be shaped with the base like that. Of course, hardwood for these brush pots became more and more popular during the late Ming, Qing, all through the dynasty. Zhetan, Huangwali, Jiqimu. Also, we find them variously shaped. These foliage-shaped brush pots were already in existence in the late Ming period. They're beautiful, simple form that also, even though they're highly worked, they show off the beautiful grain of the timber. And then the brush pot on the right is more kind of ornate with its carving in relief of small shi dragons. Of course, carved brush pots always kind of fetched a bit more money in the market, and many carved brush pots or those with inscriptions were that work was added later to sort of plain brush pots to kind of increase the value of them. There used to be so many brush pots when coming out of China. They would come in boxes and boxes, and not only in boxes, but brush pot inside a brush pot inside a brush pot. But now a piece like this, pieces like this fetch incredibly high sums of money. Here's a couple early brush pots too. The one on the left, I think, is actually a Ming Dynasty piece. Incredibly carved with dragons. And then you have also this decorative lip around the top with the inlays and silver wire. The one on the right is a good old piece of the so-called Zhouzhi style inlays. The top of this brush pot also, we can see the early style of inlay that actually may relate to that particular artisan Zhouzhi and or Zhouzhu, as he is variously known. And the brush pot on the right actually has an inscription on the bottom that says Wumen Zhouzhu. This was also like the Shi Shou inscription, widely plagiarized. And I don't think we actually know what the nature of his inlay work was actually. It's an area also I've spent a fair amount of time studying. Of course, brush pots made of burl wood were also quite popular. I mean, this beautiful grain being exposed in the plain surface. And then also during the Kangxi period, that the transitional late Ming to Kangxi period, you see a lot of blue and white porcelain brush pots produced. And you can also see how similar the forms are. You take away the decoration, you basically have these kind of simple, elegant forms with the very subtly wasted shape. The root brush pots also kind of relate to the kind of natural, spontaneous material tradition. If we go from left to right here also, you'll see the brush pot here in Cyprus is very, very natural, hardly any kind of additional work. Likewise, the boxwood brush pot. And then you get into the Zhetan and the Huangwali pieces, and they appear more and more contrived, especially the Huangwali piece. It is shaped like a pine trunk, but it kind of lacks the natural spontaneity of the other examples I've shown here. Then we'll move on to another area, which was the paperweights, scroll weights, and book rules, and wrist rests, which were also commonly found on the painting table. And for paperweights, ancient jades or ancient bronzes were often used, which could also lend some inspiration to the literati or the painter, the calligrapher at hand. They were beautiful objects, these things. Here are a couple of bronze. They are matte weights, actually. They're from the Han Dynasty. They're usually excavated objects. They were produced in sets of 4, and they were set on the 4 corners of the mat. Here we have a pair of bears that survived. There was quite a popular motif during the Han Dynasty. And this is a little coiled baby dragon that I discovered in my travels in Shanxi 3 or 4 years ago. Many of them are round like this, and this one is probably about 2.5 inches in diameter, gilt bronze. So these things also, they're heavy, and they work very well as paperweights. Then you have the scroll weight tradition. Of course, aside from bronze and stone, scroll weights were also made from dense hardwoods. And sometimes, like we see in the bottom center here, it could be inlaid with jade or bronze to become a handle, a little handle to pick up the piece. But here we see them used in various ways, including holding down the pages of books. And here on the far right lower corner, we see an accountant using a scroll weight to keep his tally slips in order. Here are a number of examples that I've touched over the years. And the top one is a Zetan piece with an inlay of mother of pearl and ivory, Longyan woods shaped a little bit like bamboo with an inscription. And then you have the plain style Zetan ones. Zetan has a nice weight to it, as you probably all know. We have a couple of Hongmu pieces with bamboo inlays. And then this one on the far right has a poem entitled "In Praise of Buying Books." So it's quite suitable for a book weight or a scroll weight. Then you have the wrist rests, of course. The wrist rest basically was used to keep the brush holding hand elevated above the painting surface. And the natural curvature of bamboo was quite well suited for this, and was also quite popular for bamboo carvers to decorate wrist rests. The shape was also imitated in hardwoods. Here you see the Zetan piece. It's also, the inside of it is actually carved like bamboo. And then the lower left is shaped like a little gutian. Another way to get the gutian on the table was to have one shaped like a wrist rest. this was actually a popular form coming out of Fujian. And Guo Shangxian was a high official there, and his calligraphy was also quite popular. And almost all of these that have this shape have his calligraphy and his name here. Guo Shangxian, it has his sobriquet. And then again, this is a lacquer example, kind of a modeled lacquer finish. Seals are another big area of collecting. And of course, everyone had a seal. It was your way of identifying yourself and passing on your name from one place to another. Artists often had a number of seals. The tradition is also quite ancient. The seals across the top, the two on right or left, are both Han Dynasty seals made of bronze. The one in the center is a Yuan Dynasty seal made of jade. During the late Ming period, seal carving became more and more sophisticated as well. And the one on the far left at the bottom is attributed to Wen Peng. His sobriquet was San Qiao. And he was the son of Wen Zhengming, one of the most famous painters of the Ming Dynasty. But he was also regarded as the founder of modern seal carving. And he had this particular technique of taking a certain kind of soapstone and firing it until it crackled. And also the surfaces kind of turn somewhat white. Of course, there are also a lot of fake seals, and I'm not sure whether this one is fake or not, but it is indicates the his moment. And many Ming Dynasty seals are quite simple in shape. Of course, there was also a wide range of materials used, especially in the soapstone family. And so many like the Huangtian, the Qingtian, the chicken blood, on and on. So the stone itself was quite valuable. Of course, the way they were carved was also quite important. And this is my own seal. And it has my Chinese name, Kretize, in the ancient seal script. It was done by a relatively well-known seal carver in Shanghai. And of course, to make the impression, you needed to have ink, seal ink, which was kept in these seal paste cases. And here you see a blue and white one on this desk. Small round cases like this have appeared throughout the centuries. And even in the Tang and Song dynasty, you find the porcelain and the silver cases pretty much of a similar style as these late Ming and Qing period pieces. But for ink, Wen Peng also explained that for seal paste, only jade or porcelain cases will not stain. And he advised against soapstone or other materials because the ink would leach into the material. And in fact, mostly what we see here, this is a soapstone. And the one on the right is a Zetan piece. The Zetan is probably a little more dense. And then this is a Jade Ink Stone, nuts Ink Stone, a seal paste case, and as well as a Ishin pottery piece. Rui scepters and wisps are ritual objects from ancient times that symbolized moral authority. Both were considered to be standard accoutrements of scholars' study. You often see them placed in a brush pot. And here's a series. The iron rui was a relatively early style of scepter. And it was said that scepters initially were used by those of moral authority or some kind of authority. And they were also deemed like sword-like in defense of virtue and also protection against mishap. And they were also used as like a pointer. The head is often shaped like a lingzhi, which is also associated with well-being and immortality. And in fact, this one here with the little shell character was probably given as a birthday gift because especially during the Qing dynasty, it became very popular to send ruis, scepters, as birthday gifts with the wish, the blessing that one would have long life. And then the whisk was also held by a monk or an abbot in his discourse with disciples and served as kind of an extension of the hand for gesticulation. Of course, also in the Buddhist tradition, dust is associated with the mundane world. So flicking the whisk was kind of symbolic of clearing the air for pure talk, as it was said. But traditionally, they were made from the tails of hair, the tail hairs of deer. And many of them that we see today also have these root-like handles. Also kind of connected with the Taoist Zen-like traditions of natural spontaneity. Of course, trays were also useful on the desk, and they appear in many different styles and shapes. They were useful to have on the desk to kind of keep things organized. And also servants would also often bring in tea or wine. Here are a few examples of the kind of varieties of materials that I've seen things. Huangwali inlaid with mother of pearl or other semi-precious materials, spotted bamboo. And this one with the shape from bronze is quite rare. And then cups for tea and wine. Many, of course, most common material, of course, was porcelain, but it also became quite popular during the late Ming period with the rise in bamboo carving and rhinoceros horn carving to produce cups from hardwoods as well. So for instance, the one on the far left bottom kind of imitates a rhino horn style cup. as well as the bamboo example. Often these wood ones would be lined with silver, but most of the time the silver is missing. The silver in linings were missing. I believe this one probably also did, but it's still quite a rare example, and it has the silver inlays around the base and with the inscriptions. And then, of course, the lacquer cups have been around for thousands of years. With all of these various objects, of course, hard to keep a clean desk by a bright window unless you have a place to put them. So there were a number of different kinds of scholars, boxes, cabinets, and chests. And this is a brief look at some of the more common forms. This style is often called a sealed chest, but it was also used as a cosmetic box. So many of them have mirror stands inside of them, and many of the decoration on is more indicates that much of the decoration, like floral motifs and all, indicate that they may have been used more as a cosmetic box. In any case, they typically have drawers inside of them and a tray in the top. Here's another Huangwali piece with doors and also similarly styled with drawers inside. We have these, of course, produced in a wide range of materials, from lacquer to hardwoods and fine woven bamboo, and the one on the upper left. And another style of chest that was also used on the desk was these tiered chests. And although they are commonly thought to be food chests, they are also used to organize objects. And then one could also easily take them if one was traveling. Of course, of the four arts of the literati gentleman is the activity of playing chess. And here we see both chess and weiqi being played. This is the typical kind of board that one would play weiqi on. These boards were often reversible with chess on the other side. This is a zipan frame with a lacquer panel, and the lines are inlaid with dark lacquer. Of course, the weiqi bowls were also quite sophisticated in their shapes. Small bowls that you could hold in your hand and easily draw out the weiqi chips from. Boards were also made to fold. This has a hinge here. And likewise, this board has, this is chess. These are chess pieces. And the other side, of course, was a weiqi board. Table stands, of course, were also used on the desk to display objects. I spent quite a bit of time speaking about table stands last time we spoke, and I spent much here other than just to review a few of the classical styles and various forms that they appeared in. And also, they were used often to set out incense on the desktop. And that is the last area I want to enter into. Is, although it's last, it is not least in the objects associated with the scholars' desk objects. And in fact, in Wenzhen Heng's treatise on superfluous things, the chapter in which he speaks about scholars' objects, in that chapter, the first 4 items are all associated with incense tradition. And here again, we see the censer and the incense box and the incense base. You see it repeated over and over here. These 3 kind of go together as a set. The Incense Center has been around for millennia. The one on the top left is an excavated example. It's Han Dynasty. Also the bronze here is a Han Dynasty piece. And then excavated from Famen Temple in Xi'an, the Tang Temple. It's a Tang piece, silver and gold. Showing a very sophisticated censer and stand. These are Ming Dynasty examples across the base, sometimes kind of animal-shaped or qilin, kind of auspicious beast-shaped. Of course, the one in the center is a very classical Shrenda style bronze. And then the porcelain piece from the Wan Yi period. The center itself is also a huge area of collecting, and I dare not go into it any more than this at this point as we wind down. But again, we look at the series of boxes too, not so much different than the seal paste boxes we were just looking at. Gao Lian said that that these kind of boxes, they should have a very tight-fitting lid for incense powder. Otherwise, the fragrance would dissipate. So that was also an important factor in the selection of a powder box. These are examples of the incense tool base. The upper one's bronze. These pieces are usually relatively small pieces. Here in the painting detail, you can get an idea of the scale, probably not more than 8 inches tall, 8 or 9 inches tall. And many of these small little wood pieces became popular during the Qing dynasty too. Huanglali, Zhetan. These particular forms were made of wumu and boxwood. They're also quite popular amongst collectors today, especially those who love hardwoods. And the traditional tools that were used were the spatula, the little spoon, and the chopsticks, which could move around the embers of the incense. Of course, today the incense tradition is flowering as even more so than it was previously, although we don't know. I don't know to what extent it was, but there are many more tools available for playing with incense. And also the variety of incense itself is a whole major field. So we're winding down here, and I've tried to cover most of the more traditional objects associated with the scholar and his desk. Of course, there were also many, many more. During the wintertime, a hand warmer needed to be used. And, there were incense stick containers. There were kind of specific details for what kind of scissor or knife one should have. There was a reading lamp. Scholars didn't just work it during the day, they had to have a night light to read by. There were flower bases. Sometimes there was a chime or a bell, and it goes on, including the guqin, which was often hanging somewhere nearby, but could be brought down to the table. So I would just like to close here. I mean, we've spoken a lot. We've covered a lot of ground. And also, when Tom introduced the subject, he introduced the painting table and the accoutrements, but he also introduced the scholar himself. And I would just like to close keeping that in mind. And during the late Ming period, there was a scholar named Fan Lian, and he wrote about the nouveau riche culture that was kind of blossoming in Suzhou. And it's a quote that's often used to kind of describe how Huangwali furniture was becoming popularized during that period of time. But he said, it is strange that even policemen who had a home would arrange a separate room as a comfortable place to rest. In the courtyard, they raised goldfish and planted various kinds of flowers. Inside, there was high quality wood tables and a horse tail whisk for dusting. They called it a study. However, I don't really know what books they studied. Of course, it is not just the objects themselves that create the ambience of an elegant lifestyle. It was the intentionality that the cultivated scholar himself brought to the selection and arrangement of impressions in his kind of secluded environment that resulted in a lofty setting. In any case, the painting table and its various accoutrements were central to a very idealized lifestyle that existed outside the dusty, mundane world, and one that has remained so even to the present time. So with that, I will close.
Thank you very much, Curtis. That was very enlightening and